Carr, I'll call you now.
Yes. Madam Deputy President, I understand that arrangements have been made in regard to responding to the return to order 1174 at this point. And the Minister is to table a letter. Is that the case?
Madam Deputy President, I have already lodged this with the Table Office, but I'm happy to provide.
Yeah, it hasn't been tabled in here yet.
So I seek leave to table.
You don't have to seek leave.
I'll table it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if I might take.
Yes. Right. So Senator Carr,
Thank you.
please
I
continue.
wish to take note of the government's response.
Yes.
Understand that the arrangements have been made to that effect. Look, the government has sought to claim executive privilege in regard to the release of the incoming minister's brief for the Australian Research Council, claiming that the public interest immunity on the basis that such the release of the documents would prejudice relations with the Commonwealth and the States. I might indicate that this is inconsistent with the approach that's been taken in the release of other incoming ministers' briefs. In recent times we've seen with the Department of Defence, the Special Minister of State, the childcare section of the Department of Education. I know in 2010 the many departments of government documents were also released. So the government's assertions in this letter that's tabled by Senator McKenzie on behalf of the Minister for Education I put to the Senate are simply not credible. What we have here is a proposition which really is seeking to disguise or hide the fact that this government is now engaged in a comprehensive assault upon universities and their role in the life of this nation. Hardly a day goes by in which this government does not bring forward yet another attack upon universities. The idea of the university itself, it seems to be under assault by this government. The idea of autonomous self-accrediting institutions devoted to free and independent inquiry is something this government finds to be a matter that they can't accept. They regard the university system as essentially hostile to their interest, and as a consequence the universities are to be harassed by this government. We see it in the terms of the specifics in regard to the government's rejection of 11 grants for humanities and social sciences under the former Minister Birmingham, a proposition which he sought to keep secret until it was revealed through the Senate estimates. The proposition that we saw 11 grants from outstanding internationally renowned scholars, all of which have been recommended through proper due peer review processes and have been assessed as being worthy of support, and some of which, of course, have been unprecedented in the areas in which they have been subject to veto, a clear political intervention in contravention of the Haldane principles which have been established in our political system, I might say, for well over 100 years, and of course a circumstance we haven't seen since we saw in the last occasion when this happened, when Minister Brendan Nelson sought to do similar things. Now, I was Minister. We had established a practice whereby if the ARC's recommendations were not accepted, there was to be a declaration, a public declaration, that there be a reason set out for why ministers should reject a grant. Little did we know that that convention, which I accepted had been agreed on a bipartisan basis, was to be rejected. These actions were taken in secret, and the scholars were not to be informed, and in fact the ARC appears to have been instructed to do so. And what we now know is that the government has further sought to cover up this disgraceful performance by seeking to impose new conditions on the granting of research arrangements in this country by the establishment of what they call a national interest test, in the circumstances whereby the current guidelines, the current application process already has built into it a national interest test. That is, people seeking to secure support from the ARC are required to demonstrate how their projects not only meet the requirements of a peer review, not only have to demonstrate their competence and their capability and their contribution to new knowledge, but they have to meet the national science and research priorities, but they also have to demonstrate economic, social and cultural advantages to the nation. The very terms that the Minister Tehan outlined when he spoke on these matters on Radio National only recently. So what's redundant about those arrangements that the Minister feels the need to impose yet further restrictions on the grants? In fact, to delay the current round of grant applications, some $300 million worth of grants being delayed to after Christmas, in fact of February, leaving a high level of uncertainty for those who are seeking the grants, many of whose jobs depend upon access to this money, and many of whom won't know whether or not they are to be employed. And on top of that, the minister's now sought, as part of this assault on the university system, to say, oh, we want further impositions of national interest by declaring a national security provision, notwithstanding there's a current test put in place through a review put in place through the defence, various defence arrangements to look at the way in which we see the Defence Control Act and how effective that's working. Not one example has been demonstrated, not one example has been demonstrated through the processes of this parliament in terms of breaches of that national control provisions or the legislation supporting it. Not one example in terms of the operations of our research agencies in regard to those arrangements. Yet the Department of Defence brings forward new proposals to have unparalleled overreach powers in regard to the capacity to search, to seize and suppress research, and to do so without warrant and without judicial processes. Now, of course, undermining the processes that were established just in 2015, which of course provide that balance between the needs of the security agencies and the needs of our international researchers to ensure that they're able to work in a collaborations with international research agencies. On top of that, we now have a situation where the government sought to claim that it's funding regional students by taking money out of the research budget and seeking to do so by, for instance, funding the students at Berwick in Melbourne, in suburban Melbourne, claiming it to be a regional campus, some 37 kilometres from this, some 37 kilometres from the CBD. It just so happens to be in a marginal seat, and claiming that that's a regional campus, and of course now taking that money out of the research program, costing some 550 jobs from the group of 8 universities alone. On top of that, we've got the situation at Caboolture, another suburban campus, claiming it to be a regional campus, a situation where money was paid through the university at the Sunshine Coast to take the facility. Money was taken off the University of the Queensland University of Technology in terms of their grants, not once but twice, and now the government, of course, is now faced with the reality. When they've frozen the funding arrangements for regional universities, the consequences become clear. And what do? They launch an attack on universities themselves. And then, of course, today what we find is that the minister makes further claims that there's no research undertaken on education in terms of the ARC. He makes assertions that that's the case when, of course, it's demonstrably untrue. Demonstrably untrue in terms of what the ARC has actually done. And furthermore, given the fact that this government closed down the Office of Teaching and Learning, which was the body that did the bulk of the education research in this country, it is profoundly ironic that they should seek to assert that it's the universities themselves that are at fault for government policies. So is it any surprise that the government doesn't want to release documents? Because what we've got now is a renewal of the cultural wars against the university system in this country. What we've got is a government that sought to commission a review into free speech. What, the IPA doesn't get enough say in this government? That they now want to impose their desires about getting more right-wingers up in universities? What we know, of course, is that the knuckle-draggers have seized control of this government. The Philistines that seek to demean researchers that have an international reputation. And of course for this government to claim that they're acting in the people's interest, when in reality we know what this is about. An attempt to appease the shock jobs, an attempt to appease the most backward elements of this coalition, and a contemptible approach to seeking to undermine the fundamental principles of the way in which our university system works, and a mechanism that actually undermines the quality of our university system and our capacity to actually, in our research system, to develop new knowledge, new technologies, new jobs, and to keep us at the cutting edge. This is a government that seems to have stopped listening, the party dominated that stopped listening about 10 years ago. And they continue to repeat the mistakes that they, of course, we saw in the Howard government. And in their last desperate throes,
Thank
the
you,
night
Senator
watchmen
Carr.
of this
Your
government
time has
have learnt
expired.
absolutely nothing.
Senator Carr.